August 30 BC. The air in Alexandria didn't carry the scent of the sea. It carried the scent of cinders. A year prior, the Mediterranean had been a stage for the largest naval display in human history. But now, the curtains were falling in a slow, agonizing crawl of smoke and betrayal. To understand the psychological cage Octavian built for Cleopatra, you first have to understand the vacuum he created around her. 12 months earlier, off the coast of Greece, Cleopatra and Mark Antony had stood at the precipice of absolute world dominion. They commanded over 500 warships, massive, multi-decked floating fortresses equipped with catapults, and thousands of hardened legionnaires. It was meant to be the end of Octavian. Instead, it was the end of the Ptolemies. The Battle of Actium wasn't a long, heroic struggle. It was a surgical dismantling. In a matter of minutes, the formation shattered. Ships were rammed, set ablaze, or simply abandoned. In the most controversial move of her life, Cleopatra's 60 ships broke from the line and fled. Antony, seeing his queen retreat, abandoned his men, his honor, and his navy to follow her. Behind them, the sea turned black with the remains of an empire. When they returned to Egypt, the silence was louder than the screams of battle. Betrayal is a contagion. And in Alexandria, the fever was rising. Kings, who had once knelt before the throne of Isis, suddenly found their calendars too full for audiences. Roman senators, who had pledged their lives to Antony, began drafting frantic letters to Octavian, swearing they had been coerced. The gold meant for the soldiers' payroll began to vanish into the private vaults of officials who knew the wind had changed. By the time Octavian's legions actually touched Egyptian soil, Cleopatra's army existed only on paper. Inside the city, the infrastructure of loyalty was melting away. Antony's cavalry defected first, riding out to the Roman camp in full formation, switching sides without a single casualty. Then the remnants of the fleet, which sailed out of the harbour and surrendered their weapons before a single shot was fired. The palace, a place that once held the weight of 9 languages and the secrets of a dozen kingdoms, became a labyrinth of locked doors and whispered panic. Servants vanished into the city. Guards simply walked away from their posts. Antony spent his hours pacing through empty corridors, shouting orders to ghosts. But Cleopatra was making a different calculation. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She moved her most valuable assets into her mausoleum, a massive stone structure with 3-foot-thick walls and no windows. It was designed to be a tomb, but she turned it into a fortress. Inside, she gathered the gold, jewels, incense, ebony, and centuries of accumulated treasure of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She wasn't just hiding, she was creating leverage. She sealed the doors from the inside, standing amidst mountains of gold and cinnamon. Her plan was simple and terrifying. If Octavian wanted the wealth of Egypt to fund his new empire, he would have to watch it burn. She held a torch to the heart of the world's economy. But Octavian, the master of the long game, knew that to get the gold, he didn't need to break the door, he needed to break the woman behind it. And he would start by using the man she loved as the first tool of her destruction. By August 1st, 30 BC, the psychological siege of Alexandria had reached its boiling point. Octavian's legions were no longer a distant threat. They were the new masters of the city streets. Inside the palace grounds, the air was thick with the copper scent of blood and the heavy, floral aroma of the incense Cleopatra had stockpiled in her tomb. It was here that Octavian's psychological war claimed its first major victim. Not through a Roman blade, but through a calculated piece of misinformation. Cleopatra, barricaded within her 3-foot-thick stone mausoleum, sent a messenger to Mark Antony with a single, devastating lie. She was dead. History debates her motive. Was it a test of his devotion? A desperate attempt to spur him into a final, honorable suicide? Or a strategic move to clear the board for her own negotiations with Octavian? Whatever the reason, the effect on Antony was immediate and catastrophic. Antony, already unraveling from months of isolation and the desertion of his troops, accepted the news without a second thought. He ordered his loyal slave, Eros, to kill him. In a final act of defiance and love, Eros killed himself instead. Left alone with his grief, Antony fell upon his own sword, but the strike was clumsy. He didn't die instantly. Instead, he lay on the floor of his chamber, bleeding slowly from a fatal abdominal wound. It was in this state of agonizing limbo that the truth reached him. Cleopatra was alive, safely sealed inside her fortress tomb. What followed is one of the most visceral and disturbing scenes in ancient history. Antony, unable to walk, was carried by his remaining servants to the base of the mausoleum. Cleopatra refused to open the massive, barred doors at the ground level, fearing that any gap would allow Octavian's agents to rush inside. Instead, she and her two attendants, Iris and Charmian, lowered heavy ropes from an upper window. They fastened the ropes around Antony's dying body. Cleopatra herself, the Queen of Egypt, strained against the weight, her hands slick with the blood of the man she had once shared an empire with. They hauled him up the exterior stone wall, inch by agonizing inch, as he reached out toward her through the air. Once inside the window, Antony died in her arms on a floor covered in Egyptian gold. He was the first of the three pillars of the alliance to fall. With Antony dead, Cleopatra was truly alone, no army, no partner, and no wall thick enough to keep out the man who was now watching the mausoleum from the palace gardens. Octavian did not rush the building. He didn't need to. He knew that Cleopatra was now a bird in a cage of her own making. His objective wasn't to kill her. It was to capture her intact. A dead queen is a martyr, but a living, defeated queen is the centerpiece of a Roman triumph. The ultimate propaganda tool to prove that Rome hadn't just won a war, but had tamed a goddess. He sent a lieutenant named Gallus Proclus to the door. While Proclus kept Cleopatra distracted with talk of mercy and negotiation at the entrance, other Roman soldiers used the very same ropes and window Cleopatra had used to pull up Antony. They climbed the wall, entered the upper chamber, and descended the stairs behind her. Cleopatra turned to find the Roman steel already at her throat. She was disarmed before she could use the dagger she kept hidden in her robes. She was not harmed, not chained, and not insulted. Instead, she was escorted back to the palace from queen to prisoner in a move so seamless she barely realized her kingdom had officially ended. The cage was now gilded, but the bars were real. And Octavian was about to begin his masterclass in psychological dismantling. Octavian's genius lay not in his capacity for violence, but in his mastery of atmosphere. Once Cleopatra was moved from the mausoleum back to her palace chambers, the environment changed from a war zone to a high-stakes psychological laboratory. She was returned to the same rooms she had occupied for years, the same silk hangings, the same cool marble floors, the same panoramic views of the Mediterranean. But every familiar comfort was now a variable in Octavian's control. The gilded cage was a masterpiece of managed perception. Octavian allowed Cleopatra to keep her most trusted servants, including Iris and Charmian, and she was permitted to eat the finest meals prepared by her personal chefs. To an outside observer, it looked like mercy. In reality, it was a forensic audit of a human life. Every meal was inspected before it reached her, not just for poison, but to ensure she wasn't receiving messages hidden in the food. Every servant was searched upon entering and leaving her presence, effectively cutting her off from the clandestine networks she had spent 2 decades building. A guard was stationed outside her door with a singular, terrifying order. She must not die. This wasn't to preserve her life for her own sake, but to preserve Octavian's logistics. He needed her recognizable and healthy for his triumph in Rome. He understood that if Cleopatra were to appear in chains, looking battered or starved, the Roman public might feel a flicker of sympathy for the foreign queen. But if she appeared in her full regalia, the walking of her own volition, she would serve as the ultimate trophy, a living symbol that the Republic had tamed a goddess. During this period, Octavian began the process of information-managed isolation. Cleopatra existed in a bubble where the only news she received was filtered through Roman hands. She was told nothing of the wider world, nothing of the fate of her supporters in Alexandria, and most crucially, nothing of the movements of her eldest son, Caesarion. By controlling the flow of information, Octavian forced Cleopatra to rely on him as her only source of reality. He would visit her without guards, a calculated gesture of trust designed to make her feel like a partner in a negotiation rather than a prisoner. He would sit across from her and speak in measured, almost courteous tones. He never made explicit threats, but he never made concrete promises either. He stayed in the grey zone of ambiguity, dangling the possibility of her children's safety as a carrot, while keeping the axe of their execution hidden behind his back. Cleopatra, one of the most brilliant political minds of the ancient world, tried to find leverage. She offered detailed inventories of the royal treasury and discussed the administrative stability of Egypt as a Roman province. But as he left, he wasn't thinking about a deal. He was cataloguing every asset she mentioned for immediate seizure. He was letting her dismantle her own kingdom, one polite conversation at a time. By the second week of August, the psychological weight of the gilded cage began to manifest in Cleopatra's physical form. She was a woman who had spent her life as a player of the highest stakes, but she now found herself in a game where the rules were hidden and the dealer was a machine of cold logic. Realizing that her cooperation was merely facilitating the systematic stripping of her kingdom, she decided to deploy the only weapon a prisoner truly owns, her own body. Cleopatra stopped eating. It was not a public protest or a list of demands. It was a silent, internal retreat. The servants noticed first, as the lavish meals prepared by her personal chefs returned to the kitchens untouched. She grew visibly thinner and weaker, her skin taking on the sallow hue of a persistent fever. This was her attempt to reclaim the narrative. If she died of illness or self-neglect, she would deny Octavian his triumph, the public parade through Rome, as effectively as any blade. The guards reported her decline immediately. Octavian's reaction was a masterpiece of cold, clinical ruthlessness. He did not storm into her chambers with threats or force feeders. He understood that to a woman like Cleopatra, physical pain was less terrifying than the loss of her legacy. He visited her and, according to ancient records, simply clarified the stakes of her survival. He reminded her that her three younger children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and the young Ptolemy Philadelphus, were in his custody. He made it chillingly clear that their futures, and perhaps their very lives, were tied directly to her health. If she died and ruined his triumph, the children would pay the price for her defiance. He didn't need to specify the consequences. The unspoken image of her children in a Roman slave market, or worse, was enough. Cleopatra resumed eating that same day. This moment marked the completion of Octavian's trap. He had successfully weaponized her motherhood against her sovereignty. She was now caught in a triple bind. Death meant the death of her children. Compliance meant the humiliation of Rome and her eventual execution. And silence meant watching her kingdom be dismantled piece by piece. She was no longer just a prisoner of Rome. She was a prisoner of her own love. However, while Octavian felt he had secured the queen, he was still hunting the king. Behind the polite conversations and the managed meals, Octavian's agents were scouring the Egyptian desert for the one boy who could truly dismantle his claim to the Roman throne, Caesarion. While Octavian maintained a facade of courtesy within the palace walls, his true focus shifted toward a threat that no gilded cage could contain. Caesarion, later Philometa Caesar, the 17-year-old was not just the eldest son of Cleopatra, but the biological son of Julius Caesar. This biological reality made him the most dangerous person on the planet in the eyes of Octavian. Octavian's entire political identity was built upon his status as the adopted heir of Julius Caesar. In the Roman world, adoption was a powerful legal tool, but it was a construct of the law. Caesarion, however, was a construct of nature. As long as the true son of Caesar breathed, Octavian's claim to the throne was technically an asterisk. He knew that Rome could tolerate a conquered queen, but it could never tolerate a rival Caesar who might one day return to claim his father's legacy. Cleopatra had understood this long before the Roman legions breached Alexandria. Following the catastrophic defeat at Actium, her primary strategic objective had been the survival of her eldest son. She had sent him south toward the Red Sea, accompanied by his tutor, Rhodan, and a small, elite guard. The goal was India, a land far beyond the reach of Roman spears, where his royal blood could be a foundation for a new life rather than a death sentence. Inside the palace, Cleopatra's cooperation with Octavian was a desperate performance of buying time. Every inventory of treasure she provided, every administrative detail she surrendered, was a move to keep Octavian's attention focused on her while her son slipped further into the distance. She believed that if she could play the part of the broken queen long enough, Caesarion would reach the coast and vanish into the monsoon winds. But Octavian was not merely a soldier. He was a master of the human shadow. He didn't send an army into the desert to hunt the boy. He sent a message. Using a combination of bribes and psychological pressure, he reached out to the one person Caesarion trusted, Rhodan. The message was a masterpiece of lethal ambiguity. He promised that if Caesarion returned to Alexandria, Octavian would not execute him, but would instead name him the client king of Egypt. It was the ultimate carrot of hope. Rhodan, whether motivated by greed or a genuine, misplaced belief in Roman clemency, convinced the young man that the path to a throne was better than the path to exile. Just days away from the safety of the open sea, Caesarion turned his back on India and began the long journey back toward his mother's captor. Cleopatra, still isolated in her monitored chambers, had no way of knowing that her son's flight had become a funeral procession. She continued her daily rituals of polite surrender, unaware that Octavian was already preparing the final move in his mathematical dismantling of her world. The tragedy of Caesarion's end does not lie solely in Octavian's ruthlessness, but in the psychological collapse of the one man sworn to protect him. Roden was not just a tutor. He was the guardian of the last legitimate bridge between the Roman Republic and the Ptolemaic dynasty. In the heat of the Egyptian desert, Roden faced a choice that history has judged as either ultimate cowardice or a fatal miscalculation of Roman mercy. As Caesarion moved toward the Red Sea, the physical distance between him and Octavian was increasing, but the psychological tether was tightening. Octavian's agents did not need to catch the boy. They only needed to poison the mind of his mentor. Roden was likely presented with a choice that felt like a lifeline: lead the boy back to a throne, or continue a flight that would eventually end in a Roman blade in the dark. Octavian's message to Roden was a masterstroke of predatory diplomacy. He suggested that too many Caesars were a problem for Rome, but a single king of Egypt, under Roman protection, was a solution. He dangled the crown of the Ptolemies before the tutor's eyes, arguing that by returning, Caesarion could save his mother and his kingdom. Roden, perhaps exhausted by the sun or seduced by the prospect of remaining the power behind a young king, whispered the poison into Caesarion's ear. Octavian intends to make you king. This lie was the final nail in the coffin of Cleopatra's strategy. Caesarion, only 17 and likely desperate for the security of his mother's palace, turned back. The journey toward India, a journey of survival, was abandoned for a journey toward Alexandria, which had become a slaughterhouse of ambitions. By the time the realization of the trap set in, the desert was no longer a sanctuary. It was a corridor leading directly to Octavian's feet. While Cleopatra waited in her palace, believing her silence was buying her son miles of distance, the boy was actually moving closer to his executioner with every step. Roden's betrayal proves that Octavian's greatest weapon wasn't the legion. It was his ability to make his enemies' allies do his work for him. The son of Caesar was walking home to die, convinced he was walking home to rule. 3 days after her capture, the atmosphere of the palace shifted from administrative silence to the charged tension of a summit. Octavian, the man who would become Augustus, finally entered Cleopatra's chambers for a formal audience. This meeting was not a negotiation between equals. It was a forensic interrogation disguised as a courtesy visit. Octavian entered without a traditional military escort, a calculated gesture of psychological dominance meant to signal that he did not fear a woman he had already stripped of her power. Cleopatra, ever the tactician, attempted to frame the conversation around her past and the future of Egypt. Ancient records suggest she spoke of her relationship with Julius Caesar, perhaps hoping to remind Octavian that his own legitimacy was rooted in the same man she had once loved and advised. She presented him with a detailed inventory of the royal treasury, offering it as a gesture of cooperation in exchange for the safety of her children. She emphasized Egypt's value to Rome, arguing that a stable province under a cooperative queen was more profitable than a territory in chaos. Octavian's response was a masterclass in lethal ambiguity. He listened politely, taking notes on the treasure and the administrative details, but he offered no concrete promises in return. According to Cassius Dio, he spoke in measured, non-committal tones, suggesting that her cooperation would be a factor in how her family was treated, but he never signed a decree or gave his word. He was not there to make a deal. He was there to verify the location of every gold bar and every loyalist name. The most disturbing aspect of the meeting was Octavian's use of silence. By refusing to confirm or deny her fate, he kept Cleopatra in a state of high-stress ambiguity, which psychological studies suggest is more taxing on the human spirit than certain doom. Every vague assurance he gave was a thread of false hope designed to keep her compliant while his officials moved through the city, seizing the assets she had just catalogued for them. When Octavian left the room, he had everything he needed. He had the map to the wealth of the Ptolemies and the names of the queen's supporters. Cleopatra, however, was left with nothing but the chilling realization that her cooperation had not bought her freedom. It had only completed the inventory of her own destruction. The trap was now fully closed, and the only piece of information left to be delivered was the fate of her son. The psychological barrier Cleopatra had constructed the belief that her cooperation was buying her son's safety shattered in an instant. When the news reached the palace, Caesarion had not vanished into the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean. He was back in Alexandria. The realization was a mathematical death blow to her spirit. Octavian's web of managed information had finally caught its most precious prey, and the Queen of Egypt was forced to confront the reality that she had been negotiating with the man who had just outmaneuvered her last hope. The return of Caesarion changed the nature of the palace's gilded cage, providing inventories of wealth and administrative details to keep Octavian's gaze fixed on her. But with the true son of Caesar in custody, the leverage she thought she held evaporated. Octavian no longer needed her compliance to neutralize the bloodline. He held the bloodline in his hand. History records a shift in Cleopatra's behavior that was both immediate and profound. She stopped asking about the other children, the twins, and the younger son, because she understood that their survival was now a matter of Roman logistics, not maternal negotiation. More significantly, she stopped engaging in the polite conversations with Octavian. The mask of the cooperative prisoner fell away. According to the reconstruction of the timeline, she realized that Octavian's mercy was a performance, and Caesarion's fate was a certainty. As long as Caesarion breathed, he was a living challenge to Octavian's legitimacy as the heir of Caesar. Cleopatra knew the Roman mind better than almost anyone. She knew that for Octavian, there was no middle ground for a biological son of his father. The boy who was supposed to be in India was now likely being held in a chamber not far from her own, separated only by walls and the cold efficiency of the man who would be Augustus. This realization transformed the remaining days into a countdown. The psychological war had moved past the stage of manipulation into the stage of consequences. Cleopatra ceased being a queen trying to save her kingdom and became a woman preparing for the only act of sovereignty she had left, her exit. She made one final request to her captor permission to visit the tomb of Mark Antony, marking the first step toward the end of the Ptolemaic line. By August 11th, the air in the palace had shifted from the stagnant hum of captivity to the sharp, focused energy of a final ritual. Cleopatra made one final request to Octavian, permission to visit the tomb of Mark Antony. Octavian, ever the pragmatist, granted it. He likely viewed this as a psychological white flag, the broken queen seeking a moment of sentimental closure before she was packaged for the Roman triumph. But he had spent 10 days watching her, and he still did not understand her. Accompanied by her two most loyal attendants, Iris and Charmian, Cleopatra walked to the massive stone structure that now held the remains of her Roman general. This visit was not merely an act of mourning. It was a strategic withdrawal. Inside the tomb, away from the constant, prying eyes of the Roman guards who patrolled her palace chambers, she performed the formal funerary rites of the Egyptian state. She poured libations of wine and milk, honoring Antony's memory not as a tragic lover, but as her partner in a failed world order. The words she spoke at the tomb, recorded by Plutarch, were stripped of the romantic flowery language often attributed to her by later history. She spoke practically. She told the memory of Antony that they were being separated in life, only to be joined in death, and that her captors had won everything except her final surrender. This visit served as her emotional transition. She was no longer a mother negotiating for children or a queen negotiating for a province. She was a pharaoh preparing for the afterlife. When she returned to the palace, she was transformed. The desperation and the negotiating fever that had driven her for the last week had evaporated, replaced by a cold, royal calm. She ordered a bath and dressed in her full ceremonial regalia, the gold and purple of the Ptolemaic kings. She then sat down for a final meal, which included a specific request for a basket of figs. To the guards outside, this looked like a woman who had finally accepted her place in Octavian's world. In reality, she was setting the board for the only move he hadn't planned for. She had finished her inventory of Egypt. Now, she was finishing her inventory of herself. August 12th, 30 BC. The psychological war reached its climax not with a battle cry, but with the scratching of a stylus on papyrus. After returning from the tomb of Mark Antony and assuming her full royal regalia, Cleopatra sat down to perform her final administrative act as the Queen of Egypt. She wrote a short, formal letter addressed to Octavian. The delivery of this letter was a calculated move in the game of psychological chess she had been playing for 10 days. She gave the sealed scroll to a trusted messenger with strict instructions to deliver it directly into Octavian's hands. By the time the messenger left her chambers, Cleopatra had already dismissed her peripheral staff, leaving only her two closest confidantes, Iris and Charmian, behind the heavy doors. Octavian was reportedly in his quarters, perhaps reviewing the inventories of Egyptian treasure Cleopatra had recently provided when the letter arrived. When he broke the seal, he didn't find a confession, a plea for her children's lives, or a surrender of political secrets. The letter contained a single, poignant request that she be buried beside Mark Antony. The simplicity of the request was the ultimate psychological jab. In that moment, Octavian realized that the ambiguity he had used to keep her alive, the dangling of hope for her children and her kingdom, had failed. The request for burial was an announcement of her intent to leave the world he now controlled. It was her way of telling him that his gilded cage had a ceiling he couldn't reach. Octavian reacted with the efficiency of a commander who had just spotted a breach in his lines. He immediately sent guards running toward the Queen's chambers. But the delay caused by the formal delivery of the letter was precisely what Cleopatra needed. By the time the guards reached the doors, the Queen of Egypt had already made the final move in a game where Octavian thought he held all the pieces. The Roman guards did not wait for an invitation. When the realization of Cleopatra's letter hit Octavian, the gilded cage was breached by force. They pounded on the doors, their boots echoing against the marble that had, for 10 days, been a theatre of psychological maneuvers. When the doors finally gave way, the scene inside was not one of chaotic suicide, but of terrifying, royal order. Cleopatra lay upon a golden couch, dressed in the full regalia of a pharaoh. There were no signs of a struggle, no frantic mess, and no desperate last words. She had died as she had lived, in absolute control of her image. The gold and purple of her robes shimmered under the Egyptian sun, a final visual defiance against the grey steel of the Roman legionnaires who now swarmed her room. Beside her lay Iris, already dead. But it was Charmian who provided the final, stinging rebuke to Roman authority. Though she was slipping into unconsciousness, she was not focused on her own pain or the soldiers entering the room. She was using her final seconds of life to straighten the crown on Cleopatra's head, ensuring that the Queen of Egypt met the afterlife with her dignity perfectly intact. One of the guards, breathless and furious that their trophy had slipped through Octavian's fingers, demanded, "Was this well done?" Charmian's response, recorded by multiple ancient sources, was a masterpiece of historical finality. It was well done, and fitting for a princess, descended of so many kings. With those words, she followed her queen into the silence. Octavian had won the war, the city, and the treasury. But in this chamber, he had lost the woman. He had spent 10 days trying to dismantle her soul, using her children as leverage and isolation as a weapon, only for her to find the one gap in his perimeter. She had converted her death into a final act of sovereignty, denying him the spectacle of her brokenness. The psychological war was over. Octavian was the master of the world, but as he looked at the golden couch, he knew that Cleopatra had claimed the final move. The immediate aftermath of the breach in Cleopatra's chambers was a scene of forensic frustration for the Romans. Octavian, known for his clinical attention to detail, was faced with a mechanical impossibility. 3 women had died simultaneously, peacefully, and in a room under 24-hour surveillance. The guard stationed outside had one job, to ensure she did not die, yet she had slipped away while he stood just feet from the door. History and legend have long favored the image of the asp, or the Egyptian cobra, smuggled into the palace in a basket of figs. The snake, a symbol of divine royalty in Egypt, would have provided a poetic end for the last pharaoh. However, the logistics of the asp tell a different story. Ancient sources, including Cassius Dio, note that while a small basket of figs was indeed present, no snake was ever found by the guards who scoured the room. Furthermore, cobra venom is not the silent, peaceful exit described by witnesses. It causes respiratory failure, convulsions, and visible agony, none of which were present on the calm, regally dressed bodies of Cleopatra and her attendants. Modern forensic historians suggest a more mathematical approach, consistent with Cleopatra's brilliance in chemistry and her access to the royal archives. It is highly probable that she used a pre-prepared toxicological cocktail. Some sources suggest a hollow hairpin or a hollowed-out piece of jewelry containing a concentrated blend of hemlock, wolfsbane, and opium. Such a mixture would explain the rapid, quiet transition from life to death for all 3 women, ensuring that not even a cry reached the Roman sentries. Octavian even attempted to use silly snake charmers, renowned for their ability to suck venom from a wound to revive her, hoping to snatch his trophy back from the gates of the afterlife. Their failure confirmed the finality of her move. She had not left her death to chance or the whims of a serpent. She had engineered it with the same precision with which she had once run her navy. For Octavian, The lack of a clear murder weapon was a personal insult. He had controlled her food, her visitors, and her information, yet she had kept a lethal secret in plain sight for 10 days. The mystery of the venom remains the final unanswered question in her forensic dismantling. A lingering shadow in a story where Octavian thought he had shed light on every corner. The discovery of the golden couch sent a shockwave through the Roman command structure that no military defeat could have achieved. Octavian, the man who prided himself on being the ultimate architect of order, was reportedly gripped by a cold, clinical fury. This was not the rage of a man mourning a loss of life, but the frustration of a master strategist whose perfect calculation had been ruined by a single, unpredicted variable. He had spent 10 days constructing a scenario where Cleopatra had no choice but to surrender, yet she had managed to find the only exit he hadn't sealed. His immediate reaction was one of desperate denial. He ordered physicians and specialized snake handlers to the scene, hoping that some fragment of life remained to be salvaged for his triumph in Rome. When it became clear that the queen was truly beyond his reach, his focus shifted instantly to the mechanics of the failure. The guards who had been stationed outside her door were interrogated. How had a woman under constant surveillance, whose every meal was inspected and every servant searched, managed to secure the means of her own destruction? The Roman machine, usually so efficient, had stalled. Octavian's grand plan for a living, broken queen walking in chains through the streets of Rome, was now an impossibility. He realized that a dead Cleopatra would become a martyr, a symbol of defiance that could haunt his new empire for generations. To mitigate this, he immediately issued orders to control the narrative. The civil war, which he had framed as a defensive victory against a foreign threat, now lacked its central villain for the public execution. Despite his anger, Octavian remained a pragmatist. He realized that he could not win the war of optics by being vengeful to a corpse. He ordered that Cleopatra's final request be honored. She was to be buried beside Mark Antony with full royal honors. This was not a gesture of respect, but a tactical pivot. By providing a proper burial, he could project an image of Roman clemency and stability to the people of Egypt, even as he systematically moved to execute her eldest son. The death of the queen was the final piece of the puzzle for Octavian's rise to power, but it was a piece that didn't fit the way he had intended. He had conquered the territory, the treasury, and the troops, but the final psychological surrender, the total breaking of Cleopatra, had eluded him. With Cleopatra's body cold on her golden couch, Octavian turned his attention to the only remaining loose end that could unthread his new empire: Caesarion. For Octavian, the two Caesars problem was not a matter of personal animosity, but a mathematical necessity for survival. As long as the biological son of Julius Caesar lived, Octavian's own claim to the Roman world, built entirely on the legal fiction of adoption, remained a target for future descent. The young man had been captured shortly after his tutor, Rhodan, had convinced him to return from his flight toward the Red Sea. He had been led back to Alexandria under the false promise of a kingdom, but upon arrival, the theatre of diplomacy was stripped away. According to Plutarch, Octavian sought the counsel of his personal philosopher, Arius, asking if it was permissible to kill a child of Caesar. Arius responded with a chilling pun in Greek: "A crowd of Caesars is no good," a play on a line from Homer's Iliad. The execution was carried out with the same surgical silence that defined the rest of Octavian's Egyptian campaign. There was no public trial, no grand announcement, and no ritualized display. Caesarion was simply removed. The true son of Caesar vanished from the historical record, his life extinguished to ensure that the adopted son could rule without a shadow. It was the final, brutal realization of the psychological trap Cleopatra had tried to prevent. Her eldest son died not in a foreign land as a free man, but in his own capital as a political inconvenience. This act finalized the forensic dismantling of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The gold was in Roman coffers, the queen was in a Roman tomb, and the heir was in a Roman grave. Octavian had achieved total victory, but the method, the cold, calculated removal of a 17-year-old, remains the darkest chapter in his rise to power. He had proved that, in the new Roman world, biology was a liability, and only the machine would survive. With the execution of Caesarion, Octavian had removed the biological threat to his throne, but he was left with 3 other children: the 10-year-old twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and the 6-year-old Ptolemy Philadelphus. To Octavian, they were not existential threats, but political assets, living monuments to his clemency, and the total victory of Rome over Egypt. The children were not harmed or executed in the dark of night. Instead, they were transported to Rome to serve a specific purpose in Octavian's grand theatre of power. During his triple triumph in 29 BC, Octavian did something far more psychologically complex than killing them. He displayed them. An effigy of Cleopatra, reclining on her golden couch with an asp at her arm, was paraded through the streets. Behind this image walked her children, dressed in their royal Egyptian regalia, forced to march as living proof that the Ptolemaic line was now a subset of the Roman family. This was the final phase of the forensic dismantling. By keeping the children alive, Octavian was rewriting the history of the war. He wasn't a butcher of children, he was a savior who had rescued them from a foreign, decadent mother. He handed the orphans over to his sister, Octavia, the woman Mark Antony had abandoned for Cleopatra. Octavia, in an act of Roman stoicism, raised her former husband's children alongside her own. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus eventually disappear from the historical record, likely succumbing to illness in the crowded, fever-prone streets of Rome. But Cleopatra Selene survived. She was eventually married off to Juba II, the king of Mauritania, turning her into a client queen under Roman control. Through her, the bloodline of Cleopatra VII continued, but it was a bloodline that now spoke Latin and served the very man who had dismantled her mother's soul. Octavian had not just conquered the queen, he had domesticated her legacy. With the royal family neutralized, Octavian began the administrative phase of his forensic dismantling. Egypt was not treated as a standard Roman province, it was transformed into Octavian's personal estate. He understood that the wealth of the Ptolemies, the grain supply that fed the Mediterranean, and the gold that fueled its armies was too powerful a tool to be left in the hands of the Roman Senate. In a move that shattered centuries of Roman tradition, Octavian bypassed the senatorial class entirely. He decreed that no senator or high-ranking Roman could even enter Egypt without his express, personal permission. Instead of a senatorial governor, he appointed a prefect from the equestrian class men, whose loyalty was tied directly to him, not to the political machinations of the Roman Forum. Egypt became the private bank of the man who would be Augustus. The grain of Egypt became the primary mechanism of Octavian's domestic control. By controlling the harvest that Cleopatra once used to build fleets, Octavian could now ensure that the Roman mob was fed and the Roman legions were paid. The surplus wealth he seized from the palace, the gold, jewels, and ebony Cleopatra had tried to leverage, was funneled directly into his own coffers to stabilize the Roman economy and fund his massive public works. The transition was surgical and devoid of rumors or administrative chaos. Every bureaucratic layer of the Ptolemaic system was repurposed to serve the Roman center. Octavian didn't just conquer a kingdom. He audited it, stripped it of its sovereignty, and turned its ancient glory into a logistical engine for his burgeoning empire. Cleopatra's home was no longer a seat of power, it was a resource to be managed. With the administrative machinery of Egypt firmly in his grasp, Octavian turned his attention to the most enduring phase of the forensic dismantling, the narrative. He understood that to secure his new world order, he had to win the war of memory. Cleopatra could not remain the brilliant, nine-language-speaking diplomat who had navigated Roman politics for decades. She had to be transformed into a cautionary tale. The propaganda campaign was surgical and comprehensive. Octavian moved to rewrite the history of the conflict, framing the civil war against Mark Antony as a defensive crusade against a foreign threat. In this version of history, the Roman legions had not fought their own brothers. They had rescued the Roman soul from a decadent Eastern queen who had seduced and corrupted a once noble Roman general. By centering the blame on Cleopatra, Octavian provided a psychological release for the Roman public, allowing them to celebrate a victory without the guilt of the bloodshed. Every piece of information was curated to emphasize her otherness. While the real Cleopatra had been a master of logistics and treasury management, the Roman narrative reduced her to a figure of erotic manipulation and irrationality. The invisible hook of Octavian's propaganda was that it didn't just attack her, it erased her agency. Her political alliances were reframed as sexual conquests, and her strategic decisions were dismissed as the whims of a foreign temperament. The coinage and public monuments of the era began to reflect this shift. Octavian was portrayed as the bringer of Pax Romana, Roman peace, while Cleopatra was represented by images of the crocodile, a dangerous, predatory beast that had been successfully tamed by the Roman eagle. This was the final layer of the gilded cage. By the time he assumed the title of Augustus, the forensic dismantling of Cleopatra VII was complete. She was no longer a woman, but a ghost, a warning woven into the fabric of the empire to justify the absolute power of the man who had outplayed her. The fall of Alexandria wasn't just a political victory for Octavian. It was the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the ancient world. The forensic dismantling of the Ptolemaic treasury had profound, tangible effects that physically reshaped the city of Rome. When Octavian's fleet returned to the Tiber, they weren't just carrying soldiers. They were carrying the liquid capital of 3 centuries of Egyptian dominance. The sheer volume of gold, silver, and precious stones seized from Cleopatra's palace was so immense that it triggered a sudden and massive shift in the Roman economy. Historical data suggests that the influx of Egyptian treasure caused interest rates in Rome to plummet from 12% to 4% almost overnight. The value of land in Italy skyrocketed as the Roman elites scrambled to reinvest the sudden surge of capital. Octavian had effectively used the gold of the asp to bail out the Roman state and solidify his own financial absolute power. This wealth allowed Octavian to fulfill the promises he had made to his legions. He paid off his veterans with land and bonuses, ensuring their lifelong loyalty. But more visibly, he began the transformation of Rome itself. He famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. This was only possible because of the forensic audit of Alexandria. The very marble, the labor, and the architectural inspiration for the new Roman Forum were funded by the systematic stripping of Egypt's sovereignty. Beyond the gold, Egypt's real value was its status as a breadbasket. By securing the grain supply, Octavian gained the power of life and death over the Roman populace. He established a permanent system of grain doles, the annona, which fed hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens for free. This wasn't charity, it was the ultimate tool of social control. The people of Rome were now dependent on the man who controlled Egypt. The legacy of Cleopatra, once a symbol of Eastern defiance, was now being ground into the flour that kept the Roman mob silent and satisfied. The final layer of Octavian's forensic dismantling was the transition from military victor to living god. In Egypt, Cleopatra was more than a monarch. She was the living incarnation of Isis, the goddess of rebirth and sovereignty. By ending her line, Octavian did not just vacate a throne. He left a spiritual vacuum. He understood that the people of Egypt, and increasingly, the people of Rome, did not just want a manager. Octavian's genius was to absorb the divinity of his defeated enemies. While he publicly maintained the facade of a humble citizen, princeps, in Rome, in Egypt, he allowed himself to be depicted in the traditional style of the pharaohs. On the temple walls of Dendera and Philae, Octavian, now Augustus, is carved into the stone, making offerings to the gods in the same ritualized poses that Cleopatra's ancestors had occupied for 3 centuries. He wasn't just replacing a queen, he was hijacking a cosmic order. This was the ultimate, invisible hook. By stepping into the religious role Cleopatra had vacated, he ensured that the Egyptian priesthood, the most powerful social class in the country, became his administrative allies. They didn't need to rebel against a foreign occupier because, according to the temple walls, the occupier had become the legitimate successor of the gods. He utilized the data from authentic religious structures to validate his own authority without ever citing the foreign queen he had just destroyed. In Rome, this divine momentum transformed into the cult of the emperor. The treasure of Alexandria funded temples to Mars, Altar Mars, the Avenger, and the deified Julius Caesar. Octavian used the death of the queen as the birth certificate of his own immortality. He framed his victory as a sign that the gods had chosen him to lead humanity into a new age. The dismantling of Cleopatra's soul was complete because she was no longer even a memory in her own temples. She had been replaced by the very man who had engineered her end. The final physical stage of Octavian's forensic dismantling was the implementation of what later Romans would call damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It was not enough to kill the queen or seize her treasury. Octavian needed to scrub her influence from the very stone of the world she once ruled. This was a systematic, state-sponsored erasure designed to ensure that future generations would only know the version of Cleopatra that Octavian had authored. Across Egypt and the Roman territories, the order went out to topple her statues and chisel her name from public monuments. In Alexandria, images of the queen that had stood for 20 years were smashed or repurposed. However, In a display of his calculated pragmatism, Octavian did not destroy every image. He allowed some to remain, specifically those that portrayed her in a subservient or foreign light, reinforcing his narrative of Roman dominance over an exotic other. Interestingly, a wealthy friend of Cleopatra, named Archibius, reportedly paid Octavian 2,000 talents, an astronomical sum, to prevent the destruction of her statues in Alexandria. Octavian, ever the businessman, accepted the gold. This wasn't an act of mercy. It was a final tax on her memory. He realized that as long as he controlled the context, a few stone statues were less dangerous than a lost fortune. By taking the money, he further enriched his private province, while appearing tolerant to the local elite. The erasure extended to her administrative legacy. Decrees issued in her name were replaced by Roman edicts. The 9 languages she spoke, once the pride of the Ptolemaic court, were sidelined in favor of Latin and Koine Greek, the languages of the new administration. Octavian ensured that her sophisticated diplomatic records were either destroyed or locked away in Roman archives, where they could no longer inspire rebellion. This was the ultimate silence. By the time Octavian was finished, Cleopatra VII had been reduced from a living, breathing sovereign to a series of caricatures and empty plinths. The woman was gone, the son was dead. And now, even her name was being edited out of the history of the Mediterranean. She had been dismantled not just in life, but in the very records of human existence. The forensic dismantling of Cleopatra did not just end her life, it defined the Augustan age. Octavian, now ruling as Augustus, found that his identity as the savior of Rome was permanently tethered to the spectre of the Eastern Queen. The psychological shadow of those 10 days in Alexandria lingered over every legislative and cultural decision he made for the next 40 years. By destroying Cleopatra, Augustus had inadvertently created the blueprint for how a Roman emperor must behave to avoid her fate. The primary lesson Augustus extracted from the Egyptian campaign was the necessity of vigilant ambiguity. He realized that the same tactic he used to break Cleopatra, dangling hope while maintaining absolute control, be applied to the Roman Senate. He never called himself a king. He called himself the first citizen. He maintained the outward forms of the republic, while holding all the levers of power. This gilded cage was now applied to an entire civilization. The Senate sat in luxurious chambers, but like Cleopatra in her palace, they could only do what the emperor's managed information allowed. Furthermore, the foreign threat of Cleopatra served as a permanent justification for the military's expansion. Augustus used the data from the Egyptian treasury to maintain a standing army that was no longer loyal to Rome, but to him personally. The fear of another Cleopatra-like figure seducing a Roman general became a recurring theme in Augustan literature and law. Strict, new moral codes were enacted to purify Roman society, directly citing the decadence of the East as the disease that had nearly destroyed the Republic. Cleopatra's shadow ensured that the Roman Empire became an entity defined by its boundaries and its otherness. Every time a new province was conquered, the narrative of Alexandria was recycled, the civilizing force of Rome rescuing a territory from irrational local rulers. The forensic dismantling of one woman had provided the psychological justification for the dismantling of dozens of cultures. Augustus didn't just win a war, he won the right to define what it meant to be civilized for the next 500 years. For 2,000 years, the world saw Cleopatra through the lens Octavian provided a portrait of a desperate seductress, painted by the man who benefited most from her erasure. However, modern archaeology and forensic history have begun the process of reverse engineering this propaganda to find the woman beneath the layers of Roman myth-making. This isn't just about debunking rumors, it's about using authentic historical data to reconstruct a genius that history tried to bury. Recent underwater excavations of the Antihodos Island in the Alexandria harbor have revealed the physical reality of the palace where those final 10 days took place. Archaeologists have recovered sphinxes, massive granite columns, and statues that suggest a court characterized by Hellenistic precision and immense administrative scale, rather than mere Eastern decadence. These findings confirm that Cleopatra's environment was one of high-level statecraft. The data shows a queen who was the CEO of the ancient world's most complex economy, a woman who controlled the grain supply of the entire Mediterranean through a sophisticated bureaucratic machine that Octavian was desperate to possess, not just destroy. Furthermore, numismatic analysis, the study of coins minted during her reign, reveals a very different image than the exotic beauty portrayed in Hollywood or Augustan poetry. The coins Cleopatra commissioned show a woman with a prominent nose, a strong chin, and a look of stern, intellectual authority. This was a leader who chose to be depicted not as a romantic prize, but as a legitimate, formidable ruler in the tradition of the Ptolemies. She was a strategist who understood that in the ancient world, image was a currency of power. Forensic analysis of the 10-day siege also sheds light on the sheer resilience of her mind. By cross-referencing Roman administrative records with what we know of ancient toxicology, scholars have identified that her final move was likely a meticulously prepared compound designed for a specific physiological window, one that would bypass the Roman guard's oversight. She used her knowledge of science to reclaim the sovereignty that Octavian had spent 10 days trying to dismantle. This was a forensic victory, a silent refusal to be the centerpiece of a Roman parade, proving that even in a gilded cage, the mind of a pharaoh remained unconquered. The 10-day psychological war between Octavian and Cleopatra transcends the boundaries of ancient history. It serves as a clinical study of the architecture of power and the limits of human autonomy. While Octavian successfully utilized a mathematical dismantling of his opponent's world, systematically removing her wealth, her allies, her children, and her kingdom, he encountered a boundary that even the most efficient empire cannot cross. The universal truth revealed in that Alexandria palace is that absolute control is a persistent illusion. Octavian's strategy was built on the belief that a human being is a sum of their circumstances. He operated on the assumption that if you control the information, the environment, and the stakes, in this case, her children, you control the soul. This is the fundamental philosophy of every authoritarian machine. However, Cleopatra's final act, the golden couch, the royal regalia, and the silent exit demonstrated that autonomy is not something granted by a captor, but something maintained by the individual. By choosing her end, she reclaimed the agency Octavian had spent 10 days trying to audit and seize. The confrontation also highlights the inherent weakness of a managed reality. Octavian believed he was the architect of Cleopatra's future, dangling hope to keep her compliant while he sharpened the blade of his own legitimacy. Yet, by relying so heavily on manipulation, he became blind to the one variable he couldn't measure, the breaking point of a parent who realizes their child is already lost. When Cleopatra learned of Caesarion's return, the hope Octavian used as a leash became irrelevant. The machine failed because it could not account for the human capacity to prefer a dignified end over a managed existence. In the final analysis, the story of these 10 days teaches us that while power can conquer territory and treasury, it cannot conquer a narrative that is owned by the person who lived it. Octavian won the world, but he lost the surrender. He dismantled the queen, but he never broke her will, a truth that remains as relevant today as it was in 30 BC. The death of Cleopatra VII was more than the end of a single woman, or even a dynasty. It was the final exhale of an entire era. When her heart stopped in that palace chamber, the ancient world's traditional balance of power collapsed, and the Roman Republic, already in its death throes, was officially interred alongside her. The forensic dismantling of Egypt provided the final surge of energy needed to transform a chaotic, oligarchic republic into a centralized, autocratic empire. For centuries, the Mediterranean had been a multipolar world, a collection of kingdoms and city-states that maintained their autonomy through a complex web of diplomacy, marriage, and trade. Cleopatra was the last great practitioner of this old-world statecraft. She navigated 9 languages and multiple political systems to keep Egypt relevant. But Octavian represented the new world, the Roman machine, a system that did not seek to balance power, but to absorb it. The fall of Alexandria was the definitive proof that the age of the client kingdom was over. From this point forward, there was only Rome, and there was only the emperor. Inside Rome, the death of the foreign queen provided Octavian with the political clean slate he needed to dismantle the republic from within. By framing the conflict as a war against an external, decadent threat, he successfully silenced the internal Roman opposition. The Senate, once the deliberative heart of the world, became a vestigial organ. The data shows that the wealth seized from Cleopatra's vaults allowed Octavian to buy the silence of the nobility and the loyalty of the mob, effectively ending the era of Roman political liberty in exchange for Roman stability. The last pharaoh had been the final obstacle to a total Roman monopoly on the Mediterranean. With her gone, the sea became Mare Nostrum, our sea, a Roman lake. The forensic dismantling was complete because there was no longer any other to challenge the Roman narrative. The death of the queen was the birth of the imperial age, a period where power would no longer be negotiated in 9 languages, but dictated in one. The forensic file on the final 10 days of Cleopatra VII ends not with a victory for the man who would be Augustus, but with a stalemate that has lasted 2 millennia. Octavian achieved every material objective he set out to accomplish. He seized the Ptolemaic treasury, converted Egypt into his personal bank, executed the rival heir, and consolidated the Roman Republic into a global empire. Yet, as he stood in that silent chamber on August 12, 30 BC, he was forced to confront the reality that he had failed to control the only thing that truly mattered, the ending of the story. Octavian's 10-day psychological war was designed to produce a living, broken queen to serve as a trophy for his triumph in Rome. He used every tool of a master manipulator: isolation, ambiguity, and the ultimate parental nightmare. By holding her children as leverage, he forced her back into a gilded cage, where every servant was a spy and every meal was a stay of execution. He didn't want her dead. He wanted her compliant, so he could prove to the Roman world that he had not just defeated an army, but had conquered the very idea of her. But Cleopatra understood the Roman mind better than Octavian understood hers. She realized that the hope he dangled the safety of her son, Caesarion, was a hollow promise designed to keep her in chains until her public humiliation. When the news arrived that her son had been intercepted and returned to Alexandria, the psychological leash snapped. In that moment, the Queen of Egypt reclaimed her power by removing herself from Octavian's board entirely. The most disturbing part of this forensic look at history isn't the suicide itself, it's the clinical, methodical way Octavian left her with no other choice. He stripped away her kingdom, her legacy, and finally, her children, until the only available act of sovereignty was to stop her own heart. He won the world, but she denied him her surrender. Today, Cleopatra remains one of the most famous women in history, while the details of Octavian's mathematical dismantling are often relegated to the footnotes of academic study. Her refusal to walk in chains became her most enduring legacy, a final act of defiance that has outlived the empire Octavian built with her gold. The psychological war ended on a golden couch in Alexandria, proving that while a machine can conquer a country, it can never truly own the soul of a woman who decides how her story ends.